Hi, my name's Gina Ziervogel and I'm a lecturer in the Department of Environmental and Geographical Science at the University of Capetown. So I do a lot of lecturing to both undergraduates and postgrads, but my research has been around climate variability and change and response to climate variability and change. So I've been interested in rural areas and how farmers have used climate information to respond to annual climate variability, but I'm also interested in urban areas and how municipalities are drawing on climate change information to make plans for the near and long future. I'm involved in Chapter 5, which is looking at local responses to disaster risks and extreme events. And so we're particularly interested in different groups at the local level, whether it's communities, whether it's local government, whether it's civil society, whether it's organizations at the local level that are providing information to help respond, and trying to look at the intersection between disaster risk and climate change adaptation. And what we recognize is that a lot of the impacts are going to be felt at the local level. So it makes sense to focus on how to prepare and manage risks at the local level as well. I think there are a range of things that need to happen. I know from my context and experience in South Africa, there tends to be a dependency from people at the local level to often rely on government to try and sort out some of their problems. And I think that both responses are needed. I think people at the local level need to understand what risk they face and look at how they can manage their risk better. And then governments need to support that process and help local communities, groups, etc., to manage the risk themselves and do what government can to put in place measures that can reduce risk. And then I think there's also quite a lot around information access and uptake of that information where it's relevant and appropriate. And often the information isn't disseminated in the appropriate way, isn't put in the right context. People are very concerned about their day-to-day living and might not see the long-term aspect. And so it really needs to be contextualized in the local setting for it to be relevant to those local stakeholders. So in Southern Africa, climate has always been very variable, so it is something that we have seen for a long time. But one of the things we've noticed in the southern part of South Africa is that we have had quite a few flood events and quite intense flood events in sort of quite close succession. So that has been quite challenging to manage because it has washed away sort of the sewage works year after year, and clearly it doesn't make sense to rebuild in the same location. And so what we're finding is people need to reconsider and try and put plans in place to rebuild in more appropriate ways. Drought is another important extreme event that we are facing in Southern Africa in many places, but again, often the activities that are in place are not that suited to years of low rainfall, despite it being quite a common occurrence. So growing maize, for example, requires a certain amount of rainfall, yet in those areas there might be a few years out of 10 where you don't expect that amount of rainfall. So maybe it makes sense to change crops, but people then need to want to change, and so there are a lot of issues around cultural preferences, etc. Yeah, I think that's a hard one because it's very easy to talk about what you think would be a nice thing to put in practice, but when push comes to shove, people want to do what's best for them, often in the short term. And I think that's one of the things about human behavior that makes this whole climate change challenge such a big challenge, is that we're being forced to try and think beyond a few weeks, a few months, a few years, to consider the long term, to consider our children, to consider the context in which we live and other people. And I don't think it's easy. So I think it does require a shift, and often people need incentives to make that shift. And once they've made the shift, they realize that it doesn't have to be such a big thing or such a hard thing. The change doesn't have to be bad. But I think people are quite averse to change often in the first instance. I mean, I can just think of myself in relation to things like recycling, because at first it was hard and I didn't know where to take it, and then once I started doing it, I couldn't stop. And then it was like, well, obviously I can't throw away these pieces of plastic. I have to put them somewhere and recycle them, and therefore I will find somewhere to take them and recycle them. And it became easy, and it became part of my life, and it was very hard. It would be very hard for me to not recycle now. I think one of the big directions that the climate change field is moving in is this area of improving and strengthening climate services. So I come more from a social science background, but I work very closely with a group of climate scientists. And we can see that the gap between the two groups is quite big. And so when I talk about climate services, I can see the need for that climate change information to be translated into what is useful in different sectors, to different user groups, at different timescales. Often the climate information about climate change is for 2046 onwards, and people that I deal with on a day-to-day basis are more interested in the next 10 or 20 years. So I've seen these two groups slowly coming together, and we are starting to make headway in what does it mean to bridge those gaps? What are the types of climate services that are needed? And I think in the developing world context, it's critically important, yet there is a big gap in this area, and so it's important that lots of people are working on this challenge now. One of the things that the climate scientists have started sort of supporting is the fact that actually people need to understand current climate variability, and that they don't actually understand their current climate variability very well. So, sure. So what that means is if a municipality is planning for the next 10 years and they want to look at flood events, they first need to understand what has been the trend in flood events over the last 30 years. How have these flood events changed? What is the trend that they're seeing? Are there more frequent floods? Are there more intense floods or not? So that at least they understand the current trajectory. And then they can look at that as well as the climate change scenarios for the future. And if the two are in agreement, then it makes sense to plan along similar lines. Whereas if the two are not in agreement, and if floods seem to have gotten more intense, yet perhaps this climate change scenarios say there will be fewer flood days, then they really need to think what it means. Are there win-win situations that make sense to put in place, even though there's uncertainty around the direction of change? And some of the things that we're seeing supported are things like building adaptive capacity. What does it mean to have access to information about the current year and how you're going to respond to that year? And so it's the process of adaptation that is becoming prioritized that I think is very important, instead of focusing on these one-off sort of technical adaptation responses that are not as sustainable and don't build the capacity to try and understand the variable climate in which we're living and how that might change in the future, even if we don't know the details of that change. That the planners within the city need to talk to the climate scientists to understand current variability and future change, so that the plans that are being made at the moment, whether it's around housing, whether it's around infrastructure, really don't undermine what is being made at the moment. So they really should consider both the current variability and the long-term variability to make cities sustainable now and in the future.